Checking my document, it appears that the last time this document was edited was November 17th, 2022. So as you can guess, it's been a little while. But anyway, today I thought I would talk about messengers, specifically the different types of messengers and how they work. The goal here is to kind of give an overview / understanding of the various privacy and security focused messengers, but specifically how they work. And I think that's extremely important in order to make the right choice on which messenger you ultimately choose to use. Just because oftentimes when discussing privacy messengers, I see charts like this, and you get told, X messenger has X metadata, and then you get recommendations based on that information alone. And I don't mean to throw shade on anything like that. And understanding metadata is really important to picking a private messenger. But ultimately, I think it's really important to understand how a messenger actually works. That way you can make the right choice on a whole bunch of different aspects of it, not just something like, say, metadata or something like that. Effectively, there's 3 different types of messengers in the wild. There is centralized messengers, federated and self-hosted messengers, as well as peer-to-peer messengers. Now, of course, sure, things have a habit of not fitting in neat little categories, especially in a fairly short video skimming over the topics like this, but I hope I'll lay them out in a fairly understandable way and show why messengers can be grouped specifically that way. Also, this is completely focused on the niche of private messengers, so for all these examples I'm going to assume end-to-end encryption is active and stuff like that. And with that, before I break down types of messengers, let's really briefly just discuss how a message is sent. The structure obviously changes from messenger to messenger, which I will get to in a bit. However, the concept is still the same. At the end of the day, the message starts on a device, which, it's typed out and then encrypted so nobody can read it except the intended recipient. And then let's just say it's from one phone to another phone. Now, of course, it could be from one phone to a computer or from a computer to a computer or whatever, but the phone example is just easiest for this. So the encrypted message is encrypted on that phone and then most likely sent to a server, though we'll get on that a little bit later. The server then holds onto the message. Whenever the intended recipient is online and ready to receive the message is then sent to the recipient, who receives that message and decrypts it and provides it for the user. And now, of course, peer-to-peer messengers aren't quite the same. Probably thinking, if you're familiar with them, you're like, wait a minute, there's no servers, and that's ultimately true. Though, of course, the internet is made up of servers and switches, so no matter what, they're obviously transferred through a number of different devices. But as I go on, I'll distinguish that sort of stuff a little bit more. All said and done, when it comes to picking a messenger structure, it really comes down to the following questions here. 1. Does my messenger require any identifying information to set up? 2. How much metadata is created and how much of it is stored? 3. Can the messenger easily be taken offline? Be that just because, someone installed the wrong update and broke a server, or because of a cyber attack, or because it's blocked by a particular company or ISP or something like that. 4. Can the messenger intercept my data if it was compromised by a malicious party or was malicious from the get-go? 5. Do I want to self-host my messenger, or alternatively have a trusted third party unaffiliated with the messenger host my data? 6. Is my IP hidden from the messenger host? And 6.5. Is my IP hidden from the person I'm messaging? 7. Can my device be connected just whenever? Or does it need to be online 24/7 and/or do I have to wait for messages to be delivered until both the receiving device and sending device are online at the same time? And 8, how much of the existing data do I want to be in control of? Alright, now we can start getting into the 3 different types of messengers, and I figured I would just start with centralized messengers. These function when you're registered with the centralized service, which handles the distribution of messages, and in this case, the message would be encrypted on your device, so only the recipient can read the message. The message would then be sent from your device through an ISP to the messenger host, which accepts the incoming message. The messenger host then holds on to the encrypted message, but of course can't read it, assuming end-to-end encryption, and it just holds on to it until it sees the message recipient is online, and then sends it through the message recipient's ISP to their device before their device, and only their device, decrypts it and reads the message. A good example of this sort of system would be Signal, and I'm just going to use it to quickly demonstrate its pros and cons. First, Like in Signal's case, it's really easy to open an account with a centralized messenger service. You don't need to try and host anything or have a process running on your device 24/7. You just register it and Signal handles all the legwork in the background. It also will accept and hold any messages you sent, and then will deliver them when the second recipient device is online. That way you don't have to have them both online 24/7, and because there's a server that's routing the messages, your IP address is not disclosed to the recipient and vice versa. However, there are also some drawbacks with centralized messengers. First off, when you register, they usually require some identifying information, such as a phone number and email. Now, not all do, and it varies from service to service, but that generally is the case. Similarly, centralized messengers by their nature get all of your metadata. Now, of course, they may or may not store it, and that will change from messenger to messenger, but because of their structure, they get all the data, such as when the message comes in, their size, times that the user is online, and which IP they connect with. Now, because of course centralized messengers by their very structure have to get this information, oftentimes it's a focus to acquire and store as little of this related information as possible. Again, using Signal as an example, they seem to do well with it, but because it's inherent in their structure, it's still a risk since you're trusting all of your data to the people who run the messenger. Last, a centralized messenger is likely the easiest to compromise or shut down. Even though Messenger is still end-to-end encrypted, if the messenger was compromised or malicious from the get-go, even though the data is encrypted, you could still theoretically be sending them to be unencrypted by the server, which then re-encrypts it and sends it to the recipient, aka a man-in-the-middle attack. And while that said, using Signal as an example, though I haven't reviewed Signal's code, I doubt it would be easy for Signal to be compromised by a man-in-the-middle attack, but it is technically possible and maybe more likely depending on the centralized messenger you're choosing. Regardless, however, it's also probably the easiest form of messenger to block or attack. Just again, using Signal as an example, which Iran did not that long ago, since it's a centralized group and they only have to block one centralized group of servers instead of having a much harder time trying to block a loose and ever-changing group of devices. Now, let's talk about federated and self-hosted messengers. Now, I don't mean to be confusing since some messengers can fall into one category but not the other, but I kind of combine them both into one group, and let's break this down a little bit as well. Network-wise, these messengers work the exact same way as centralized messengers. Data travels from a device to a server or a group of servers, which then route the message to the intended recipient device. And in this case, however, the server is not operated by the messenger developers, but instead the server is operated by either you or a third party of your choosing. Being self-hosted or being hosted by a third party is true of both self-hosted and federated messengers. In this case, federation operates just like email, where anyone can get a domain and a server, and then that domain and server can send messages to anybody else who is on the same platform, regardless of whether they're on the same server or not. Or at least that's the short version. Of course, sometimes some things can federate with some devices, but then they're blocked from federating with others, etc., etc. But the long and the short is, ideally, you can connect from any server to any other server. For example, I could set up messenger1.com with a matrix server and then register the account member at messenger1.com. Then somebody could set up the server messenger2.com with the account on it, member at messenger2.com. And despite these servers being hosted by different people with different accounts on different servers, the two accounts could message each other and join the same groups with very minimal setbacks and restrictions. Alternatively, with just a generic non-federated self-hosted messenger, you could set up, say, messenger1.com or insert messenger at X IP address, and you could message people within the same server, but if it's not federated, you just can't message people on other servers. Now, I'm going to discuss quickly the pros and cons of using a self-hosted federated messenger. In most cases, if you're going to self-host a messenger just for general communication, it may be worth self-hosting with a federated messenger because it's nice to be able to talk to other people who are not on the same server. However, if you're going to self-host a messenger but it's not federated, you can just disregard all the federated related pros and cons, and I will talk a little bit more about this in the very end when I talk about specific messengers. Firstly, the biggest benefit of self-hosting something, you are either in complete control of your data, or otherwise you've delegated control to someone else who you presumably trust. In either case, you don't need to worry about what some unknown group is doing with your data. Similarly, while it likely won't prevent the government from giving a subpoena to your ISP, hosting provider, and/or domain registrar, there are no requirements to hand over personal details to other users of the service, such as a phone number or email address or something like that. Additionally, unlike centralized messengers, anything self-hosted, be it federated or not, is really hard to block or attack on a mass scale. Sure, it's easy to block one company and shut down everything, but it's really hard to find out everybody who's hosting a small server for their family and get them to stop, even if that small server can communicate with other small and large servers on the network. Last, similar to centralized messengers, the server does all the heavy lifting. Once the server itself is set up, all you would need to do is download the required apps or programs to use the messenger on your personal devices, sign in and use the messenger. If the intended recipient isn't online, the server will store the messages that are sent and then pass along once the recipient is online, just like a centralized server. And having such a setup where the server handles all the routing of messages also prevents the IP address of the sender's device from being revealed to the receiver's device. And of course, again, while your IP address and such would be revealed to the server itself, the server would presumably be in your control or in the control of someone who you trust. So even though metadata like that is collected, it wouldn't be quite the same as if it was hosted by a messenger company. There are, however, some drawbacks to a messenger setup like this as well. The first of which is just the cost and time. In the case of self-hosting, you'll likely need a domain, and you will definitely either need to set up a home server and get a static IP, or you would need to pay for a VPS. The other main drawback to self-hosting messengers is metadata. Oftentimes, centralized messengers often really focus hard on minimizing metadata, such as, date of the message, size of the message, and who it's going to. However, most self-host messenger products are less focused on that, and with that, of course, being the expectation that if you're self-hosting or being hosted by someone you trust, then a little bit more collection of that sort of data isn't important because it's not outsourced to some company that you may not fully trust. But of course, if you're relying on somebody else to host it, say you just register a matrix.org account, then you can only trust them as much as you can trust any other centralized provider, except of course there's a little bit more metadata being stored. Similarly, if you're messaging people on other servers, even if you run your own server, the other server is receiving messages and metadata about your account and the messages being sent between them. And finally, there's always the risk that a server you set up or that is set up by someone you trust is compromised and said metadata is accessed. Now, of course, again, at the end of the day, the messages themselves would be end-to-end encrypted, and the dangers of metadata against your privacy are largely dependent on what situation you're in, but the more data in other people's hands, or just existing in general, is worth considering when evaluating privacy. Last, there are peer-to-peer messengers, and unlike centralized or self-hosted/self-hosted federated messengers, there are no servers involved in peer-to-peer messages, at least none related specifically to the messenger. In this case, the device who intends to send a message looks to see if it can locate the device that is receiving the message, usually through DHT, and then if the recipient device is online, it's sent straight through the internet to the recipient device without any servers involved aside from ISPs. Let's quickly go over the pros and cons. First, of course, there's no worries about metadata, aside from general ISP logging, which is applicable in any case. Since there's no centralized server to route messages, the sender and the receiver are the only ones to hold such data. So as long as you trust the other person you're sending the message to, there's no metadata being put into a third party's hands, while also not requiring you to set up or operate any sort of server. Next, there's generally no worry about registering with identifying details like a name or an email or phone. Since it's decentralized, it will pretty much be guaranteed to require nothing, but in most cases a private and public key pair that's generated automatically on the device with no identifying information whatsoever. Last, it is extremely hard to block or otherwise shut down peer-to-peer messaging services. Not only is there no group of centralized servers, but there's not even home servers and the like. It's just a bunch of random devices with generic IPs communicating with each other. There are, however, some drawbacks to such a messenger structure. First, and likely the largest, is the fact that any messages sent cannot go through unless both the sender and the receiver have an internet connection and are online at the same time. Secondly, since there are no centralized servers routing the messages, the IP address of the sender is known by the receiver and vice versa. Now, of course, IP addresses can be hidden by routing the data through Tor and the like, and some messengers such as Briar do this. However, of course, routing the data through Tor or another proxy service makes the messenger easier to block, and also in Briar's case, makes it too clunky to perform audio and video calls. And last, because peer-to-peer messengers generally rely on public-private key pairs and DHT, there are no easy usernames. Generally speaking, when it comes to technology, you can have easily rememberable name organized by a central authority, like domain names, an easy-to-remember name powered by a decentralized authority, like a blockchain, or you can have a non-human rememberable name organized by no authority and just math instead. In this case, with math and the magic of DHT, you get a long username of random numbers and letters, which you can then share through a QR code or by copying and pasting it. Then somebody else would just simply import it into their contacts and set a contact name, and once the name is added to the contacts, it becomes super easy to use, but of course is complicated to get it set up, much more at least than a simple username or email. Well, that's about that, at least in regards to messenger structures. The different structures of various messengers, as well as the different ways you can use them, make them almost impossible to compare them unless you look at your specific needs. I mostly wrote this just to help you understand what your options are and make your own decisions, and this is where you can click off now. That said, I thought I would quickly go over what I personally recommend a handful of situations. I know that this is kind of the exact opposite of what I just said about trying to make this to help explain exactly how to make a decision instead of what to make as a decision, but I ultimately felt like this wouldn't be complete without quickly going over what I would personally recommend in a handful of situations. First, if you wanted a 2-click setup type of messenger that requires no friction to set up and is easy to introduce to other people, then something like Signal would probably be great to use. Secondly, if you want a messenger that does not require a phone number like Signal, and don't mind a few extra steps of setup while still mostly otherwise having a frictionless centralized style messenger, then I would recommend Session. See the notes in the end. Third, if you want a federalized messenger that will act somewhat similar to Discord in the sense of messaging users and joining communities, as well as messaging other people who may be on the same platform but are on a different server, then I would recommend going with Matrix, especially if you intend to use a third-party host and not host it yourself. That said, if you want a self-hosted messenger that will be a little bit lighter than Matrix, and you want to communicate with the smaller group of people who are either on the same server with no federation whatsoever, or optionally to just federate with a handful of smaller servers, then I would recommend going with XAMPP. 5. If you want a peer-to-peer messenger and don't mind your IP address being shown to people you're in communication with, and you want audio and video calls, or if Tor is blocked and you can't have Tor integrated, then I would recommend using Tox. And finally, if you want a peer-to-peer messenger and you want your IP address anonymized with Tor, or if you want to message people offline through Bluetooth and LAN, not touching the internet, then I would personally recommend you go with Briar.